were perfect, God would be offended. So I don't want my flaws on air. This is not my profession. So I'm so happy to have you all as guests on this third roundtable. I'm starting to feel like Jerry Lewis, though, on the telethon, the fundraising telethon. That's okay. And we have such an experienced moderator in Ted Kuntz that I'm just going to hand it over to him. And I won't interrupt, Ted, unless I have to straighten you out. Go ahead, please.
Well, I expect that will happen pretty early, Rocco. So I thought I'd start with you, but let me just begin. As I was reflecting upon this session, I was thinking about the history of Vaccine Choice Canada. And Vaccine Choice Canada began in 1982 in response to the efforts of the Ontario government to restrict access to a public education of those children who were unvaccinated or selectively vaccinated. And then I thought, how ironic is it that today, I suggest that our public education system is now a major part of the problem. Our schools are no longer safe places. Our schools are no longer nurturing healthy citizens. And if anything, I believe that they're harming our children. And so we're going to walk through three questions during our time together. One is really looking at what is the problem. And I think we just want to clearly articulate what we're up against. We want to explore what the options are to address this crisis in our public education system. And then I'd like us to spend a few minutes really thinking about if we're going to innovate our public education system, what would we be thinking about? So let's start with that first question. What is your assessment of the current situation in our public education system? What are you most concerned about? And Rocco, I do want to start with you because in addition to being a lawyer, you're the parent of young children that are in the school system, and you're seeing firsthand the impact of our public education system and our children. What can you bring to this conversation?
Just leave it to Ted to always put me on the spot. Well, I've got one child in a school for gifted children. It's a private school. It's run through the auspices of the University of Toronto, and I have the second child, a fraternal twin, in the public school system. And on a daily basis, what I can tell you is what I see is a scenario I, in my 62 years on this earth, would never have imagined. It is oppressive. Mm. It is like, it is like reading and watching an in-color version of The Lord of the Flies, where a lot of the participants are the teachers and the school board. We're suing the school boards over these measures, this masking and lockdowns of the schools. It is like if before COVID came, you wrapped your child's mouth with one, or now, as Joe Biden said, 2 masks, told them to stay away from his or her friends, and that you couldn't play outside in any different way, and that you had to be gagged for the whole day, the child authorities would take your children away. Now it's the minimal normal. How does that happen? It brings back to us the sort of comment in a song that Bruce Cockburn had when he said, the problem with normal is it keeps getting worse. And that's what's happening in the school system. It is untenable for me as a parent. My sons have masking exemptions, but most of the children are wrapped up. They're gagged. And as you know, my background before I was a lawyer was a clinical linguistics. When you wrap somebody's face at this age, it distorts, stunts, and retards their ability to develop language, because most language is 70% facial expression and body language. It is not spoken. These children will not, this is going to go on for a couple of years. These children will not develop the ability to recognize humor, sarcasm, nuance, understatements. All of that will be lost to them. Anyway, I see a horrible situation as a parent, and moreover, as a constitutional lawyer. It's just, for me, untenable, period.
Christine, you've got children in the school system, and you're hearing from parents all the time. What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Hi, Ted. I am hearing a lot of very, very sad stories. particularly around the mental health of the children, very young children. A lot of children are as young as grade 1, 2, and 3, telling parents that they don't want to go to school. Some of them are saying they don't want to live. We've had a significant number of very, very young children saying that they're suicidal. And, and I'm hearing the same from teachers too, that they are so stressed out. They're being forced to teach kids under these circumstances. They're being forced to police masking, as well as educating the kids. And it's stressful for everyone. It's stressful for the parents. The rules keep changing. The rules aren't the same everywhere. And masking exemptions are not being honored in the schools. The parents are forced to get a doctor's note and disclose medical information that should be private. And then the school boards, who are non-medical professionals, they are deciding whether or not to accept these medical exemptions. And they're often overriding doctors' notes and recommendations and for the masking. And then these kids are being forced to stay at home. And I think it was Amina said earlier that the biggest impact we're seeing is on low-income families. And the most that contact me are single parents. And every time the schools close, they don't have anywhere to send their child. They can't go to work. They can't make money. And they can't afford lawyers. And I think that's why it's particularly important that we, the charter was written for everybody, but probably especially for those with the greatest need, the lower income, the most vulnerable populations. And so we have this charter that should be available to everybody, but right now what we're seeing is the charter is only available to people who can afford to hire a lawyer to make sure their rights are being protected. And that's why it's so important that everybody, really, really try to support these cases, to support Rocco, to support the Constitutional Rights Center financially, because the charter should be available to absolutely everybody, but most especially the most vulnerable populations that we're seeing right now, who are the most affected. And I think it's wonderful that Rocco is going out of his way to take on these most vulnerable cases, and bring this like to make it equitable, to make the law equitable. And that's how it should be. And somewhere along the way, that seems to have been lost.
Thanks, Christine. Amanda. Children's health defense is really about defending the health of children. And so I'm sure you're hearing lots. What are you hearing?
Oh, wow. I mean, Christine and I deal day in and day out with parents that are terrified for their children to be in school, let alone just go back. As soon as we had heard Bill 218 passed in March 25th of 2020, we knew what was coming down the pipe, and we knew the progression it was going to take. And as much of a conspiracy theory as it sounded back then, here we are. We're living it in living color right this second. And I mean, maybe that allows us to foresee what's coming next. And I mean, we all know it's going to be about the vaccine next. So, but I yanked my kids out of the system. I pulled them right out of their school board. There was no way it was going to happen, and they were going to be bullied and traumatized and taught how to no longer be children while at school. It's absolutely, I can't even think, just the trauma that come of this from certain children, especially children with learning disabilities or that don't understand, young children. And like Rocco said, they're getting a lot of their, they take in their learning from seeing facial expressions, so there's that. I guess my main concern about this whole thing are the long-term effects that are going to be left over from this debacle. And that's what it is. It's an agenda and it's a debacle.
Well, and it seems so counterintuitive that, our children, we know medically, are not at risk from COVID in terms of long-term consequences or mortality. And yet they are subject to these incredible measures that create the kind of long-term consequences I think that you're talking about, Amanda, of psychological, emotional, developmental. as well as their physical health. Their immune systems are being compromised by these measures.
Right. And not only that, Ted, but, and I meant to mention this earlier, but even the exemptions that are not being honored, we're creating a system of bullying for these children, not only from the children, but these adults that think it's okay to bully these children into wearing a mask when they're not even supposed to be in the mask category. It's sickening.
I mean, those are the kind of stories that I'm hearing is the teachers are shaming, bullying, coercing, punishing children that are not wearing masks. And so the schools have become a very psychologically unsafe place. And then the question is, what are we really teaching our children? Peter, I'm sure you hear lots from parents because I suspect that many that move into the homeschooling are because of their level of discontent with their public education system. What are you hearing?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I guess there's probably two things I'd like to share on that score. First of all, we've seen homeschooling numbers across Canada literally double this school year. So, you know, we were at a certain point a year ago, and this fall we saw, you know, literally thousands of families decide, you know, they're going to withdraw from the public system in particular. And we've had a chance to talk to a lot of those families over the last number of months. And the thing that we found interesting is most of them said to us, hey, I was just planning to do this temporarily for the year to try and avoid many of the problems we've just heard about. What has in fact happened is these people have discovered they quite enjoy homeschooling. They're developing relationships with their kids. They learning about them in ways they never knew, really having a good time. And they're seeing their kids develop in a way they hadn't developed before. A lot of the stress and anxiety that the public system had imposed on them, and in fairness, social media as well, a lot of that's dissipated in the homeschooling environment. So a lot of those families are telling us we're going to continue for the long term. So there's been a fundamental shift in the educational system in the direction of homeschooling that way. I think a lot of other parents have also recognized that it's an option now. Maybe in the past, public schooling was the only option they knew about. Now, I think people are aware, you know what, there may be different ways to tackle this education question. The second point I'd make quickly, Ted, is that, you know, the typical homeschooling family has not been affected in terms of their academics so much through this past year. I mean, we continue on as we have before with our book learning and so on, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But you know what? That's only half of our school day typically. The other half of our school day are the sort of the more group activities that you would probably take for granted in the public system, things like sports, music lessons, and so on. We tend to take our afternoons up with things like that, field trips, and we also do group learning opportunities of an academic nature with other homeschoolers. So homeschoolers don't stay in the home all the time. In fact, we spend half the day outside our home. And over this past year, we've lost the ability to do much of that. So our home educating has also been tremendously impacted by the lockdown rules, the lockdown restrictions. Now, there is some good news I'll share with you. This is probably not anything anybody on this call is aware of at this point, but just in the last week, we had some success with the Alberta government. After months of pressure, they finally agreed to recognize that home educators should have the same opportunity to meet together outside the home in group environments. So if the schools are allowed to do it, the Alberta government's now said, hey, you can go to a community center, church basement, whatever. You have to follow the same rules everybody does with masks, social distancing, you know, hand sanitizer, et cetera, but you're allowed to do it. And so our goal next, of course, is to go to the other provincial governments, including the government here in Ontario, and make the same case. So that's where we're at today.
Peter, before we move on, I just want to point out that I think that we may take for granted that homeschooling is an option now, but that's not necessarily the case globally, is it? That there are countries that actually outlaw homeschooling. Have I got that right?
That is correct, although the trend is generally towards greater freedom. Now, Germany, Sweden, and a few other European countries, it is absolutely prohibited. But much of the rest of the world, we're actually seeing adoption of homeschooling as a legitimate educational model. So we have a huge movement in South Africa, a growing movement in Brazil, where the laws just changed to allow for homeschooling on a level playing field. Russia of all places. 100,000 homeschooling families last year, and growing rapidly. So, and doing so with the endorsement of their government as well. So yeah, as you look around the world, the model that's being developed in North America has been exported literally globally, and I met homeschoolers from nations all over the world.
Well, to me, we have to be looking at options, and we're going to get into that. But I just want to spend a few more minutes with what I think are the problems with our public education system, particularly as it relates to the situation with COVID. My biggest concern as part of Vaccine Choice Canada is that we're using the school system as a way to coerce families to vaccinate their children against their own personal choice. We're seeing those mechanisms of coercion in both Ontario and New Brunswick in particular. And you don't have to look far. You look to California, where they are mandating the COVID vaccine for kids to return to school. That's what their intention is. And so it seems to me that schools have become dangerous places where our medical freedom is being subject to the coercion of through a public education system. And then probably even more disconcerting from my perspective is that we're using schools as a place to vaccinate children without the knowledge or consent of parents under the mature minor doctrine. Do any of you have concerns about those, or anybody want to speak to that?
That's part of the reason that I did take my oldest out. And I'll give you a little bit of a story that had happened to her. This was in grade 7 when she was due for the HPV, those rounds, meningococcal, whatever. I had pulled her out that day and had found out later on that more than half of her class had declined it. Well, to my astonishment, a teacher made a comment to me about how the public health nurse went into her classroom to find out who the ringleader was, talking to other kids to decline these shots. And she's teaching them about consent and whatnot. And she was, because she hears it around here all the time. But for that public health nurse to walk to my child's classroom to address a ringleader who is at that time 12 is unacceptable. 150% unacceptable. So that didn't end well. I can tell you that. But this is the lengths that we're going to. It's bullying from adults in an authoritative position to these children that don't know the difference, because now they're not being taught. They're in school all day. They're not being taught to stand up for their rights. They're not even being taught their rights. You know, so I have concern with that. That's my concern there. So,
Christine, could you talk a little bit about just with the mature minor doctrine, its scope, and what is the age that a child can make their own supposedly informed consent decision about vaccination?
In Ontario, we don't have an actual age as far as I know. But the public health, we have known them to go into the schools and give information to students. And if the parents have not signed the consent form for the vaccines, they are encouraging. And yes, we have video footage because kids all have phones now. So we have videos, we have audio of public health misinforming children and giving them misinformation and telling them if they don't get the vaccines, if they don't consent to it, that they won't be allowed to continue to come to school, that they'll be suspended and they'll miss exams and they'll have to do the year over again. So there's a lot of pressure that goes on, and that's with generally the grade 7 vaccines for the HPV, Hep B, and meningitis vaccines that they're giving right now. But my greatest concern is, yes, they're going to add the COVID vaccine to the Immunization of School Pupils Act and try and make it mandatory for children to have it to attend school. And parents who choose not to have it will have to jump through a lot of legal hoops to get around that, to sign the exemptions. As you know, in New Brunswick, the government has tried to make vaccines mandatory without exemptions. They've tried to remove the exemption process. And so that's a huge concern for us. Definitely in Ontario, we are one of only 2 provinces that have mandatory vaccines for school attendance, with exemption allowance, being Ontario and New Brunswick. So definitely a huge concern here. My 17-year-old is not in school right now. He's actually my first child that's ever gone to public school, because my older 4 children were all homeschooled all the way to college and university. And I have a bit of a funny story about that, because Peter will laugh at this, because they always talk about, back then they would say, well, what about socialization? What about socialization? What do you mean you're homeschooling? What about socialization? And now everyone's like, oh, socialization's bad. You should not go to public school because there's socialization. So now they're telling everyone to do the opposite of what they did then. So yes, my 17-year-old, he is the first one of all of my children, of 6 children, to actually attend public school. And I pulled him out too in September. Like, he hasn't gone since last March. Because we don't want him exposed to all the other negativity. And he's also in French first language, and you cannot learn, it's hard enough to learn one language when people are wearing masks and you can't see. I mean, when I'm in a store, I can hardly understand someone wearing a mask. But for children to learn a second language is definitely hard.
Ted, can I pipe in to give a clarification for fear that people watching are going to get the wrong impression about the applicability of the mature minor doctrine?
Yeah,
that doctrine is a doctrine that says, to the exception of parental consent required for a minor for any medical treatment, in certain circumstances, the mature minor doctrine can apply. That if a child is, intellectually, emotionally mature, that they can consent to medical treatment despite their parents' consent. The Supreme Court of Canada has made it very clear that the mature minor doctrine is not to be exaggerated. Mature minor doctrine is often invoked in cases of imminent physical injury and or death to the minor. So you're in a car accident, you're bleeding to death, you need a blood transfusion, or you need certain surgery, your parents are not locatable, the minor has the wherewithal to say, yeah, I know the risks, do it. You can't apply the mature minor doctrine to vaccinations. I did a video on this on the Constitutional Rights Center because the WHO fraudulently and maliciously put out a paper discussing and iterating what informed consent is. And as one of the things that they posit in that paper is that if you're in school and you're a mature minor, by virtue of the fact that you've agreed to attend that school, you've consented to all their vaccination program. That is not the law in Canada. It's a criminal assault, it's an actionable tort, and it's unconstitutional. That is not the law. Informed consent means, number one, that you are told all the possible risk factors in any medical treatment. They have to outline what the adverse effects could potentially be. That's what informed means. And then that you have the capacity to voluntarily consent to that. So for instance, you couldn't roll out a mandatory mature minors program in a school for special needs kids, for instance. You do not supplant the general law. The parents must consent and they must be informed when applying any medical procedure or treatment onto their minor children.
And I'm glad for that clarification, Rocco. And I would suggest that right to informed consent is not being honored. It's not being protected. It's not being supported in our school systems. That our kids are vulnerable to intimidation and coercion.
Well, it's being subjected to renegade illegal subversion, is what it said. Some schools, my son's school, for instance, the principal quite laudably respects all exemptions under the law. But there are certain renegade maniacs who think they can take the law into their own hands, and they do, but that's not to say they have that authority. They do not have that authority.
And that's where we need to be educated as citizens, as parents, about what rights we have. And to me, that's why your Constitutional Rights Center is absolutely critical, is because we are so uninformed. We assume that these authorities are acting in our best interests. And I would suggest that there's a capture, they've been co-opted by an agenda that is not about what's in our children's best interests. And
Well, if
and the
anybody
red-
is interested that's listening, there's a video on my YouTube channel on our website, which has been temporarily taken down for today because it's live broadcast. But there's a video that's been seen by thousands of people, entitled "Your Right to Decline Mandatory Medical Procedures and/or Treatment." And I would encourage everybody who's interested in this issue to go watch the video, and it's very specific as to what your constitutional rights are.
So let's move on to how we address this crisis in our public education system. And to me, it's about figuring out what alternatives exist, but also there's got to be, there is legal action here. And Rocco, maybe you want to talk about what our legal options are in terms of addressing the crisis in our public education system today.
Well, we are we are poised to file an application in the Ontario Superior Court with an 800-page expert affidavit on the inutility of masking. We have hired 2 experts in England on the inefficacy of the PCR test, which drives all the numbers and all the measures. And we have a child psychologist, a medical doctor, working on his affidavit on the detriments of masking, both psychologically, long-term, developmentally, and medically. And we hope to file that in the next 3 weeks to obtain the earliest date. They're playing, it's not just the masking and testing measures. It's the flip-flop, which is so arbitrary. The flip-flop between we're closing for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. This is psychologically devastating. My son hates being on a computer screen for 6 hours a day. It's just not tenable. It's just unhealthy. And so couple that, Ted, with the fact that it just came out that one of the government's advisors on COVID measures in the education context has just been revealed to have been on full-time salary for the teachers union. And he just couldn't spot that kind of conflict of interest. We're dealing with a corruption that's beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And so the government is getting advice on educational measures under COVID for somebody who's on retainer to the teachers union? Really? Without disclosing it?
I think that's one of the things that's happening is the deception, the distortion, the manipulation, the duplicity is being exposed. And that's one of the good things of this crisis. But it's hard to see how these institutions and these systems that we have placed our trust in, we're discovering don't deserve our trust, or blind trust anyways.
And by the way, I should mention that in this application, which is going to have a parallel statement of claim for damages, we are personally suing on behalf of parents for their children, the principals, school trustees, and superintendents who refuse to abide by the law and taking the law into their own hands. We're going to take a certain amount of accountability into the mix. We're going to sue them personally.
Well, and I think, Rocco, that's where we're going to start to see a difference when people aren't hiding behind a position and they're actually personally held liable and exposed.
Right.
That may be how we take down this growing tyranny that we see happening.
No principal has the right to think that they can say, I have a medical letter from a specialist who says this child cannot and should not wear a mask, and where exemptions to masking are part of the law, and decide that as a school principal with a BA and 1 year teacher's college, he's going to override the medical opinion of a specialist. I mean, that is so beyond the pale to constitute a criminal offense in my view.
Shocking, isn't it? Yeah. Peter, I think homeschooling is probably the option many parents are going to begin to want to know more about. Tell us just more about your association and how parents begin to think about this as an option.
Yeah, I'll give you two quick thoughts. Kind of one that encompasses what we've just been talking about, and that is where we've seen vaccine mandates imposed on children. New York State is a great example. Many people on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with it, where the mandate was imposed both on public school students and private school students. We saw an incredible increase in the number of parents who just said, I can't do this. I don't want my child harmed. My only option is homeschooling. And so the Homeschooling Association in that state saw 10,000 families join, in the first month after this was introduced. And of course, we're seeing a similar situation. Obviously, the problem in New Brunswick is sort of ongoing, I would say, with the same government in power. So, we're going to be facing this across Canada. Now, you'd think as a homeschool leader, I would be, in a sense, happy about this because, hey, all these people are leaving the public system and coming to us. Well, that might be true temporarily, but my concern longer term is, we're a minority. And if they can do this to the majority of families, the majority of children across the country, they can do it to us eventually too. So nobody's safe when these governments renegade on issues like this. So that's a perspective from a homeschooler. When it comes to our organization, yes, we provide a range of services to homeschooling families, the primary one being legal defense, as our name implies. And despite the fact that homeschooling is legal across Canada, all 10 provinces, it wasn't always that way. We've had to fight for those rights, but it is legal in all 10 provinces, all 3 territories. And even though that's the case, as we were talking about earlier, sometimes principals, school board officials, social workers, and others either are ignorant of the law or don't respect the law when it comes to home education rights. And so we find we have regular work defending families right across this country. You don't have, every province, it's not restricted to just 1 or 2. So those are problems that continue to arise. And so we have a large membership as a result. Now, for families that are thinking about making the switch and want questions answered, I'm just going to give you a real simple website rather than talking at length about how to do it. This website answers those questions. It's simple. It's homeschool.today, homeschool.today. So if anybody wants to know more, check that out and you'll get the answers you need.
Thank you, Peter. That's helpful. Amanda and Christine, what is Children's Health Defense hearing in terms of some of the options, or how are parents finding their way out of the public education system and finding other alternatives? What's happening there?
A lot of people I find, and I mean, we get hundreds and hundreds of messages a day. It's heartbreaking. People feel hopeless, and they really shouldn't. There is help out there. There are other options out there, and Christine and I try to kind of put people in connection with each other so they can learn from one another. Like one of the Facebook groups that Christine had started was Masking Education Ontario, where parents can go and discuss, whatever situation it may be, their hopelessness, how their child is reacting to what's happening in the schools, or how they're reacting to not being able to be at school, or masking, not masking, that kind of stuff. It's just, there is hope for a lot of the hopeless. And we want to be a beacon of light where people can find those answers. At the end of the day, hope isn't lost. We're all still here fighting as a collective. Everybody's sitting at this round table today. Hope is not lost. So with that being said, what I would say is donate to the Constitutional Rights Center, because Rocco fights day in and day and night for these families. And just because you don't see it or hear about it doesn't mean it's not happening. So please, whatever you can do, donate to this wonderful center. This man has a heart of gold, and he loves this country, and he loves all of you. So please find it in your heart, just at $5.
Christine, anything you want to add to this conversation before we move on to the next?
Definitely. One thing is that known Rocco for 2 years now. And the one thing that I've learned about Rocco is, in the courtroom, he's a bulldog. But, when it comes to the kids, he's a big bear. Like he's met Amanda and my children. He fights for these kids because his heart is in it, right? Like his heart is in the right place. And he really has a big heart, especially when it comes to kids. And we're just so grateful and lucky to have him. And the other thing I want to point out is just today it was announced in Ontario that Rocco had mentioned David Fisman. He was on the science committee for advising the provincial government on. He was advising them to keep the schools on lockdown, and then we found out just yesterday that he was on the payroll of the teachers union, who had been fighting right when we first went into this lockdown last March. Our teachers unions were all on strike. And they were fighting for smaller class sizes. And so now these teachers unions have hired this person and they're getting him to fight for smaller class sizes before we're allowed to return to school. So they're exploiting this virus or this situation to gain personally or professionally for their teachers, for their union, what they have been asking for since last year and for many years, and more funding and smaller class sizes. And they're doing it at the expense of our children. And that's the most unfortunate part. And so every time they do another lockdown, they open the schools. So the very next day, they turned around after this was exposed, that this had happened. We were supposed to be having our schools closed till the 11th of February. Today, they announced, the provincial government announced that the schools are going back on Monday. So the truth comes out, and then things do get better, right? So the kids are going back to school, but the downfall is that every time they reopen the schools, they add new measures. And the one measure they've added is they're going to do asymptomatic PCR testing on the students. And one of the biggest problems with that is, other than we know that it's obviously a fraudulent test, when you test in an asymptomatic or where there's no viral, no COVID, when you test in a population with very, very low incidence of COVID, you are, considerably more likely to get false positives. And that creates fear and panic, and then kids get sent home and schools get closed, and it has a whole a lot of ramifications attached to it that nobody's really thinking about when they're putting this into place, that are going to be more detrimental to the children than just staying home and not going to school. So there's really no research being done there. If I can pipe in for a second, Ted, on that point, I noticed that too. We'll be including that in our school challenge. The mandatory testing is also unconstitutional unless you're informed and consent to it. My experts tell me that we've hired for this challenge is that, and it goes without saying, like every other COVID measure we've seen, has never before in the history of science or medicine been heard of, or used, or tested. So self-isolation, lockdown, it's just never been used. The notion of an asymptomatic disease, my expert tells me, is hogwash. Mm-hmm. It's a notion that's just got invented during the last 9 months. If you're sick, there's going to be symptoms. You can't be sick without symptoms, especially with a respiratory viral infection. Sure, you can be a carrier of a certain disorder and not be sick, but not a respiratory one. You're going to have symptoms. And before I turn it back to you to wrap up, Ted, I just wanted to say as well that people should understand where constitutionally the right to education sits in this country. The right to education is a statutory right up until high school. Free education is a statutory right under the Education Act, first of all. And that education must be dispensed with the terms of the Human Rights Code, which includes equality of treatment. Education in Canada by the courts has also been interpreted
by way of that right to education through the International Convention of the Rights of the Child as a Section 7 charter right. Your children have a Section 7 charter right to free education up to high school in accordance with the equality provisions of Section 15 of the Charter, to be accommodated without discrimination on various grounds. So people should understand that, and that the school boards and the school unions and all these vested interests and these fiefdoms, from superintendents to school boards, are not God. And they can't appropriate and misappropriate public funds like this to their own interests and ignore the law under which they act and the Constitution that binds the legislature and everybody else. And lastly, before I turn it back to you, Ted, I'd like to say, while I accept all these great compliments from my Amanda and Christine, because I was never loved as a child, so I don't resist them, but I am not alone in the Constitutional Rights Center. There's Amina Shirazi, there's Paul Slansky, there's Samantha Kumara, there's Jalissa Phillips, who's here. There's Barbara Lukakova and Alex Bornett, who all assist and do a lot of the work with me. So I don't want to be painted as a lone ranger here. Okay, back to you.
Thank you. Those are important things. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to honor Carrie and Nicole's commitment to innovation. So I'd like to go around and hear from all of you. If you were to create or reinvent or improve or affirm what we hold precious in an education system, what would be the most important things to you? Peter, can I start with you?
Sure. I think that choice is really the key thing, and that's probably obvious coming from me, but it hasn't always been that way. Certainly, teachers' unions are, as we've just pointed out, a very powerful voice at Queen's Park and at legislatures across the country. They cherish the monopoly they have on tax dollars and the power that comes along with it. They have great influence in provincial politics. We know who the previous premier was, for example. And I think that one thing COVID's really changed. There's been lots of bad things, but when it comes to public policy, the one thing that's really changed, I think, in people's minds, and this is probably more important than anything, I mentioned it before, is just the idea that people do have choices now. There are different paths to a good education, and the public system's monopoly is not everything it was once cracked up to be. And I think parents are beginning to see that. That's a fundamental change in our society. I think it's a very healthy change. I think we'll always have a public system. I don't think that's, I don't think it's about to disappear, but I think there are many other options that people are more seriously considering now and choosing. And that's a good and healthy thing. I think the rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak.
Thanks, Peter. Amanda, what would you envision for an innovative public education system?
Oh boy. Well, it's been lacking accountability for a long time, in the regards where children aren't being held accountable for, their work or their tests, or, it's almost like getting a participation trophy everywhere you turn. Now, if you're not allowed to fail a student, how are they supposed to learn and grow, right? So along with that, I mean, honesty, integrity, choice, as Peter said, respect, a two-way respect for the teacher and the student, rights, bring back teaching rights and freedoms. Because if these kids don't understand it or know it, they can't fight for them either. Right? So I think but accountability, I feel, is key. There is just no, and my mother was a teacher for her whole life. And I remember when it switched to the point where, you could get a mark for signing your name to a test, but you couldn't fail the kid for not filling out the rest of the test. Do you know what I mean? There's a problem with that as well. And it creates bigger problems down the road. So it's a little part of a big whole.
Thank you. Christine, 30 seconds.
Yep. For me, it would be more education and less indoctrination. We really need these kids to be taught the charter rights. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids graduate and they're adults now and they're calling me and saying, what section of the charter does this mean? I mean, didn't you go to school, public school? They should be taught the charter rights. They should be taught their rights. And the other thing is they all go to school and they all wear a pink t-shirt someday in February, anti-bullying day. And now it's the teachers bullying the kids. It's hypocrisy. So they need to be more, like Amanda said, respectful to the kids and respect that, yes, their family values too. Like, you don't need to indoctrinate these kids. Their family values need to be just as important as the rest of their education.
Thanks, Christine. Rocco, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for participating in this panel. And I think, the school context and the school environment is not only critical to our society and future generations who are being damaged by it, but is also the worst cesspool of disregard for the law that I've seen in this entire COVID measure context. It is the school teachers, principals, superintendents, and boards who have urinated on the law and the Constitution. Because the original ministerial order and the general regulations with regard to, for instance, masking are very clear. There is a legal exemption. There's a legal requirement in the ministerial order of the education minister to accommodate, and that means under the Human Rights Code. Under Regulation 546 of 20, under sections 2 sub 4 and 2 sub 6, the schools are also bound by that general regulation. And 2 sub 6 says when somebody invokes an exemption, you're not allowed to ask why, and you're not allowed to ask for proof. Yet parents are providing proof because they want the best for their kids. And then these morons or principals that we're going to sue are saying, we don't care what your respiratory specialist says. I think you don't qualify for the exemption. An opinion that's blown out of their backside with no expertise and no respect for the law. We're talking about vigilantes pretending to be school principals and teachers. When you have that kind of disregard for science, medicine, and the legal exemptions, you're a vigilante. I'm not saying they're violent, but they're still vigilantes to the law. And the fact that this government is not clamping down on that because they have other problems in their negotiations for another collective bargaining agreement is pathetic. It's pathetic. And so that's all I have to say about education and the COVID. And I look forward to getting into court on this soon.
Thank you all. Thank you for this important conversation. And let's hope it leads to a much better system of education.